Every religion has a picture that is captured by that story. And in that picture, we stimulate our imagination towards the things which are larger than ourselves. Call it spiritual, call it religious, call it what you like. But the important point is that for many people, we think in pictures. And that it is our imagination that gets stirred in various ways, pictures being perhaps maybe the primary way, and stories. And the stories that the pictures tell. Imagination. Without memory, imagination fails. And without stories, memory fails. So I put this together to say that there is, I think, a very clear connection between stories, pictures, imagination, memory, and who we are. That, to me, is the ethical movement, and part of, I think, our limitations is that we don't tell stories a whole lot, that we don't really rely upon pictures a great deal, and instead we utilize words and arguments as being the essence of our commitment. And I think that's a mistake. In some ways, ethics has never been more prominent than it is today. We have all kinds of ethics centers, often situated in universities, but not exclusively. We have ethics that is taught across the spectrum in universities, in law schools, in business schools, in medical schools, in a variety of professional schools, social work, nursing. We have ethics embedded in curriculums, in university settings. And then we have freestanding centers dedicated to ethics. Last week or 2 weeks ago, we had, I guess it was last week, somebody talking about the Ethics Bowl, which is to bring the notion of ethics into high schools. And while all of that is good, I think that they're limited, and in many ways they're actually flawed. If you think about ethics in the professional schools, often what is meant by teaching ethics there is, in law school, primarily compliance with the law. That is, let's find out what the laws say about what the laws say under the rubric of ethics. And that's what we teach. And that's what we mean by ethics. Learn what the law is, comply with the law, and you're an ethical lawyer. Justice? Where is it? I'm not sure that justice is taught as part of ethics in law school. I'm not even sure that justice is taught at all in law school. And business school, very similar. That the most business ethics courses really have to do with compliance. That is, what do we know about this law and that law that's been passed by Congress and local legislators, and so on. Again, it's compliance. It is looking at ethics in terms of rules and regulations. It isn't in terms of imagination. It isn't in terms of anything beyond that. Often, I'm generalizing. What ethics sometimes is reduced to is learning how to argue effectively. We have a leaking, oh, I could see it. Yeah, the pipes are sweating, right? Yes, Judy, you want to move?
No, I feel I've just been blessed.
Okay. It's the holy water. A little bit dirty. So the way some people will define it is that ethics then is learning how to argue effectively. And I think that that has been true of some people in the ethical movement that I know, which is, okay, I can make a better argument than you can, and therefore I must be more ethical than you are. I could outsmart you. But clearly this is not what Felix Adler meant when he founded the ethical movement. He was dedicated to social justice, and he was also very quickly dedicated to helping to make people's lives better in a very personal way. Despite himself, Adler was dragged into this notion of ethics that was much more expansive than arguing, much more expansive than philosophy, and also took him beyond the borders of social justice. Felix Adler, you might know, also taught ethics at Columbia University. And he was a colleague of John Dewey and other eminent philosophers at Columbia. And he was not really part of the inner circle there. He was criticized by many of the philosophers, professional philosophers, because they'd say to him, Felix, if they called each other by their first names, I have no idea. May have been Professor Adler, Dr. Adler, Reverend Adler, maybe even Reverend Adler, because their criticism of him was that when the philosophy gets tough, you always have your religion to run back to. Philosophy doesn't answer all of life's problems, and Adler was interested in addressing all of life. And therefore, he sort of ran into a problem that was very difficult for him and maybe even insoluble, which was that he also was frustrated by the philosophy department because it also had its view that was too narrow, and conversely criticized by those in the philosophy department of being an inadequate philosopher. The deeper issues of life are what Adler and the ethical movement have also been aiming at. And in that way, I think that the term ethics has been unfortunate. I don't think that when we say that ethics is our religion, that it really says anything. It seems to me that that is almost an empty phrase, since so many people mean different things by ethics, philosophers meaning one thing, in popular parlance meaning another, besides which it is a pointer that really doesn't have much of a content yet until you begin to actually figure out what it is that you are committed to. When people ask me what my religion is, I say that my religion is ethical humanism. That is, that humanism really, to me, is the more basic notion. And ethics, then, is a qualifier. It's an adjective, if you'd like. It isn't any kind of humanism. It's a humanism that really is concerned with ethics. Then when people ask, well, what does that mean? Then we could spell that out. But I do think it's more helpful, but other people may have different opinions about that. When people talk about ethics as being intellectual, as being philosophical, I think what they do mean is critical thinking and complex reasoning. And those things are important. I by no means mean to diminish them. I think that they are important. I think that in this country today, certainly if you look at the people who are running for presidential candidate in at least one of the major parties, the notion of critical thinking and complex reasoning is simply out the window. That's to be ridiculed. It's diminished. It's the opposite. It's like, how stupid could I be? The more I am anti-scientific and the less critical I am about anything, and the more I could just simply spout whatever I want to spout, somehow that's to be a good thing. It's an anti-intellectualism. So certainly critical thinking, complex reasoning are important, but it's not all that there is to what we're about. So is sensitivity, and so is courage. If you want to be a good person, critical thinking and complex reasoning help, but it's not complete. There are other components. And here's how an analogy I often think of. I think of the bridge columns that appear in a newspaper. And people like to read bridge columns. Probably some of you in this room like following the bridge columns. I know we used to have a couple of members of the society who followed them avidly. I don't. I never look at them. One of the reasons I don't look at the bridge column is because I don't know how to play bridge. It would be completely ridiculous for me to spend my time reading that column when I have no idea what it's about. So, if you want to be a good person, first you need to know what it means to talk about being a good person. If you want to read the bridge column, first you need to know something about playing bridge. But after you know what the rules are, if you want to really read the column, you have to be able to know not only what the rules are, but you have to be able to manipulate those rules in some way. You have to, in other words, you have to play the game. Similarly, I could know what it means to be a good person, but my judgment can be so impaired. I could be so limited in my critical thinking and complex reasoning that I have no idea how to go about being a good person. I'm completely befuddled by that. Well, I could know how to play bridge. I could know how to even be a good bridge player. But I have no interest in going beyond what's in the newspaper. That is, I never have any interest in sitting down and actually playing a game. So somebody might know what it means to be a good person, can even have good judgment, and then decide, I don't care. They're simply not motivated enough. There are other things that are more important: being famous, making money, manipulating people. We can think of lots of things. Entertaining myself. Indulging myself in pleasures. There are all kinds of things that people can do other than being interested in being a good person, even though they know what it is. Okay, maybe even their judgments are good about that. So you need to be motivated. That's a psychological factor. That's not a philosophical one. And then the last thing is, I can know what the game is. I can even play the game well. I will choose I want to play the game. You know what? The point is, I can't bring myself to do it. In other words, we lack the courage of our convictions. There are many, many people of goodwill who don't really ever get engaged in being a better person because there are all kinds of pressures on them not to do it, limitations in which they're incapable of actually doing what it is that they would like to do. One of the nice things about an ethical society, since presumably we're all dedicated to improving our lives and the life of the world, is that we support each other in the courage of our convictions, so that you can go out and try to do better in the world and perhaps be rebuffed there, but come here and find other people who say, I understand what you're trying to do. Good for you. Give you a pat on the back, give you some support. Lend support, time, money, effort, maybe to the cause that interests you. But that's a hard thing to do, to find the courage of our convictions. So I'm going to maybe talk about some of the things that I do in my classes, since I teach ethics. And I would think that the way in which I do it is non-standard. It's not typical, I think, of how ethics classes get done most of the time. And that is, I spend probably a third of my time talking about psychology as much as I do about cases and philosophy and theory. So here is something I brought in for you. Lynn was my artist here. I want to show you my mechanical ability is so bad that I didn't trust myself to do this. I had to rely upon my resident expert in my household to do this for me. Here, can everybody see this?
No.
Okay, here you are. That's my problem. This is a physiological problem, not a psychological one. I turn to the left. And after all these years, I've developed some arthritis from having bent in the same direction all of my life. When I read the newspaper in the morning, I notice I'm always putting it this on my left side, so I don't look right. Thank you, Felicia. Here you are. For those of you... Okay. Here's the next. This was more difficult to draw. For sure, I needed Lynn for this one. Now we have 3 lines. The question is, the first one that I showed you is the same length as which one of these 3 lines that I'm showing you? 1, 2, or 3? David, you think 1. Felicia? 1. 2. 1. What'd you say, David? 2. 2. We have a 1 and a 2 here.
See it again?
You can see it again. One, 2, 3. There is no line. How about now? 1? Okay. This is an experiment that was done in 1950 by Solomon Asch. I think it's one of the most interesting psychological experiments. In this experiment, and he handed out on the card the line for people to look at, and then the card with the 3 lines, and asked people to say which lines equaled what. What was the answer here, Lynn? What did you do?
1.
1. Okay. So this one is the same as 1. Or now 3, right? 1. What Solomon Asch did is he arranged for a group of people to get together to answer this question. The trick of it was that everybody in the group but one person was in on the experiment. And everyone except the one person was told to give a wrong answer most of the time. So now the one person is sitting there and listening to everybody give an answer. And do you know what happens? 3 out of 4 of the unsuspecting subjects, that is the people who weren't told, they weren't in on this, 3 out of 4 agreed with the incorrect answers given by the rest of the group at least once. And 1 in 4 agreed with the wrong answers 50% of the time. So why would somebody give an incorrect answer when maybe sitting here way out there, it might be a little bit hard for you to figure this out, but certainly if it was closer and you had a chance to examine this more closely, I think most people, I don't know what percentage it would be, but most people would get the right answer. And yet in the Asch experiment, it turns out that that's not so. So when Asch did the experiment, the conclusion was that there's group pressure that forces people to say something that they may not believe, which is, whoa, wait a minute. I have all these people around me who are telling me this. Maybe I should agree with them. But the problem with the assumption is that you don't really know why it is that people change their minds. That is, that people really have the right answer in mind and say something that they didn't believe, as were they, in essence, lying in order to get along with everybody else. A couple of years ago, somebody decided to update the experiment. Let's do the same, essentially the same experiment, but this time let's use more sophisticated equipment than that we have now, mainly the ability to look at brain images. And let's look at what we see going on in somebody's brain when they answer these questions. Set it up in the same way. One person is not in on the experiment, everybody else is in on the experiment. Burns finds that approximately the same number of people change their mind as in the original Asch experiment. But now we could see what's going on in people's minds. That is, which part of the brain is being activated when they do this. And what he discovers is it's not the cognitive part of the brain that changes. It's the affiliative part that changes. The conclusion is that those people who change their minds are changing it and they really believe what they're saying. Those people who don't change their minds, that part of their brain is the part of the brain that has to do with affiliation is really going kind of wild, which is they're uncomfortable. The people who change their minds are very comfortable. They fit in with the group. The conclusion of both Ash and Burns studies, which you can go look up yourself online if this is confusing you a little bit and you want to find out more about it, but the conclusion is that when people change their minds in a group, it isn't that they have a different position and are keeping quiet, but rather that what they believe in, what they see, literally changes. Their view of the world is literally altered because people around them have a different view and are expressing it. In other words, to be a minority in a group is very uncomfortable. Most people's comfort takes them to literally seeing the world differently, literally adopting a different perspective, a different notion of what reality is, a different set of values. It's very hard to resist group pressure. You don't have to raise your hand to go to the bathroom. In this class, it's okay to just leave. Oh, I'm joking with you, Jerry.
On candid camera some years ago, they set this up in an elevator. Everybody, instead of facing forward, faced sideways. The elevator went to different floors, and as people got on, they saw everybody sideways, and they turned sideways too.
Yes, and right, that is the original Ash experiment. The question was, why are people doing this? And the more recent experiments that are done with the MRIs is the reason that people are doing it is because they believe that's what should happen. That is what the reality of the world is. When that elevator opens, everybody's facing the wrong direction. The reality is I'm supposed to face that way. It isn't that if I face the right way, it would be weird, but you really believe that is the right way to face. Okay, so this is one of the things that I would do in the class, because it does seem to me that if you're going to do a class in ethics, and I teach 3 different kinds of ethics classes at the university, that's simply to talk about ethics, about what the right thing is, without people being aware of the enormity of group pressure and what it means to be part of a group, is that people at some point being in, as let's say, a corrupt business environment or corrupt media environment, will actually begin to see that they're not what they will come to believe that what they're doing is right, even though everybody is corrupt, because everybody else is doing it. And they believe that is the way the world is supposed to function. They will no longer be critical of it, because they will have the inability to be critical of it, because their definition of what is real and what is true has been altered. Knowing that, in some way, you hope serves as an inoculation. That is, be wary of group pressure. It's a real phenomena. It's not simply what you think is the right thing, but it's also to be aware of what happens to you when you're in a group of people who do see the world differently than you do. Something else that I talked about in the last couple of weeks was something that was in the newspapers that I thought was very interesting, and that was the prisoner exchange in Israel. If you didn't follow the story, just very briefly, there was an Israeli soldier who was captured 5 years ago, I think. 5 years ago, and he was being held as a prisoner by Palestinians. And last week or week before, Israel finally negotiated an exchange in which he came home to Israel, and in exchange for 1,000 plus Palestinians. You have one person being freed in exchange for 1,000 plus others. Now, who were the 1,000 plus others? It was a whole grab bag of prisoners, from common criminals to people who were involved in terrorism. Why did Israel agree to such an exchange? The American policy, and the policy of most governments, and the policy of almost all police forces that I'm aware of, is that you don't negotiate with terrorists and you don't negotiate with kidnappers. that's what Israel did. Why they do this? In Israel, you have a very small country that is besieged. And we do know that when there is a common enemy, people who otherwise would be enemies with one another join forces and see themselves as a collective. In Israel, being as small as it is, as beleaguered as it is, in which there is a common ideology, no matter how frayed that might be, but people still sort of believe it. The posters of Shalit were up all over the country. There probably wasn't a single Israeli who wasn't aware of him being in prison, knew his face, was probably no more than 2 steps removed from his family. Probably everybody knew his cousin, his brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, etc. Went to school with him. Were his teachers. They all knew him. They negotiated for his release in the same way in which I suspect anybody in this room who had a family member who was kidnapped wouldn't do whatever you could do to raise the money to pay the kidnapper to get back your daughter, your husband, your mother. We could get the money. And then we say, if I can get the money and I don't pay it, doesn't that mean that I think that money is more important than a life? We don't put a value on life. So therefore, if I can get the money to pay this kidnapper, I'm going to do it. I think that the Israelis thought of themselves in that way. This was our family. This was our brother that was captured. You do whatever you can to get that person back, even if it means negotiating with terrorists or your enemy, however you want to define it. And why does the government have a different policy? Why is it that the police force, the police departments won't negotiate, won't pay ransom, discourage families from paying ransom when they can easily get the money? Well, the theory is that if you pay kidnappers what they demand, more people will go into the kidnapping business. People will do some kind of a cost-benefit analysis and say, the chances of my getting caught doing this is not as great as the benefit I would receive by the $1 million ransom I'm going to get. I'm smart enough to outwit anybody. So, go into business. I think this is what's happened with the piracy off the coast of Somalia. Approximately 1 ship a month is now captured and held for ransom. The more often, more frequently the ransom is paid, the more it emboldens other very poor people who have no other prospects in life of having anything to go out and capture another ship. Those waters now are the most dangerous in the world. We don't know how to stop the piracy, but the governments have a policy, which is you don't negotiate. But the companies which have their employees who are being held and who could raise multi-millions of dollars and want their ships back, they'll negotiate with the pirates. And this is an international problem in a country that really doesn't have any rules, so nobody's able to enforce anything. So what you have then is the dilemma between the concern that you have for an individual, and we shouldn't put any value on that person's life, any monetary value, and on the other hand, a policy which says if you were to do that, you're in fact making life worse for other people. If you've released 1,000 people who are in prison, assuming that they deserve to be in prison, they're now free. Look at the mayhem that they're going to cause in the future. You have more people now who already are criminals and terrorists who go back to the business of criminalizing and terrorizing people. All of that for the sake of one person? Most governments say no. Israel said yes, because I think it was acting as an individual and not as a country. But this is a dilemma. It really is a real problem that we have. We have a problem, this question was asked of Herman Cain recently. I don't think it was at the presidential debate, but it did appear in the newspaper, which is they asked Cain, what would you do after this Israeli release about the prisoners in Guantanamo for the sake of getting the release of one captured soldier? And he says, I can see myself authorizing that kind of transfer. All government officials said, are you crazy? Negotiating with terrorists? What he was doing was consistent with what Israel did and what I think most of us would do if it were our family member. Now, having said all of that, I also support what Albert Camus once said. I believe in justice, but I will defend my mother before justice. Justice is an abstraction. My mother is a living, breathing human being. We put ideas ahead of people, but when we don't, we might be endangering more people by not acting on the thing that is just. There was also another story out of the newspapers I brought to class for us. I think it's worth us thinking about, and this involves Mitt Romney. There was a feature story about Romney in the New York Times, in which, I think it was the New York Times, in which they were interested in looking at Romney's religious background, because we know a lot about his political background. He was governor of Massachusetts, which he tries to hide. Other people tried to hold against him. But not much has been said about his religious beliefs. We do know he's a Mormon, and he was a Mormon in Massachusetts. Well, in the Mormon church, Romney rose up to the high ranks, so that he was really the leading Mormon in the Boston area. Bishop, I think is what they may call it in the Church of Latter-day Saints, which meant that he was in charge of the organization, but also sort of the chief confessor of people who were Mormons. So people who had problems and wanted to not go to a secular therapist, but wanted to talk to a spiritual advisor, sought out Romney for advice. One of the people who came to Romney was a single mother who was pregnant. And she says to Romney, I'm not so sure about whether I want to keep this baby or whether I want to have an abortion. And Romney responds by saying, the Mormon Church permits abortion only in a matter of incest or rape. This is not authorized by the church. And left it at that. When the reporter interviewed this woman, sort of reading, if you could have the picture of the woman rather than the words, this woman was deeply disappointed and angry. He didn't treat me as an individual. He treated me as a statistic, if you'd like. He responded to me with a principle. He didn't respond to me with his heart. There are principles that guide the church. He told her what the principles were. She wanted somebody to hold her hand and to guide her through the whole process. And he didn't do that. Again, a different notion of what it means to be ethical. One thing to stand up and espouse our position on abortion, whatever that might be. Another, to sit with somebody who is agonizing about what to do with their life. Also ethical. Sometimes in conflict with one another. T.S. Eliot once said that the split between the heart and reason is the disease of the modern world. split between the heart and reason is a problem. I don't know whether it is unique to the modern world. It's always been a problem. How do we put together compassion and wisdom, actions, social policy, and personal concerns, family and state, social justice and empathy? Or as Felix Adler once termed it, and for him was an irresolvable problem, the conflict between the one and the many. I don't have an answer. I think that these are enormously difficult problems. One of the values of an ethical society, one would hope, is that we can come here and think through these things together without attempting to win an argument, without attempting to prove that we are more ethical than anybody else, being aware of the problems of group pressure, that all of us might think one way and the one person who thinks differently. How do we listen to that? If you're the one person who thinks differently, how do you open yourself up to the possibility that you're wrong and at the same time not be unduly influenced by group pressure? So I just wanted to close with a statement by the ethical culture leaders written in 1916, who said, "We hold that the end for which each individual exists on earth is, as far as human nature can permit, to change from a selfish being into a generous one, and of a selfish society into a cooperative one. We hold that each person counts, that each human being is important and cannot be replaced. This is the challenge, for each to make life better for all."
Different others.